Many will say We Were Soldiers Once and Young is a book about the fight in the Ia Drang. When you step back, it's a love story. It's a love story about mom and dad, about their love and commitment to soldiering and the nation. So I graduated West Point in 1984, spent 10 years in the infantry, spent a lot of time at Fort Benning, all the standard infantry schools, and then about 10 years in, I swapped over, got a graduate degree, and then started working on the acquisition procurement side. Retired in 2011 and came down here to Auburn, Alabama. What's notable about my father is he put absolutely zero pressure on any of us. So my choice of a service was all mine. He would obviously give us advice and thoughts as any father would, but he never pressured us and said, I want you to. I think you should. He allowed us to choose our own path.
My name's Steve Moore. I followed my father into the family business of the Army, just like my brother Dave. I went to West Point, graduated in 1975. Following West Point, spent 20 years in the field artillery, retired in 1995. I retired from IBM after 15 years serving in different positions. And since then, I've been retired and highly engaged in my successful YouTube channel related to kayaks and fishing. As a kid, you don't really realize what your parents are like until you become a parent yourself. And you kind of wonder, well, how would mom and dad handle this? Or, holy mackerel, they really knew what they were doing when we grew up.
Well, my name is Cecile, and I'm fondly known as a military brat, born into a military family in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. I had a really robust career in merchandising with Staples as the last one, 21 years with them. And recently retired in April, and just having a wonderful time.
I'm Harold Gregory Moore III. My dad, General Hal Moore, was Harold Gregory Moore Jr. And so I was born in 1951, actually at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. My brother was born at Fort Benning, Steve. And I live currently in Dallas, Texas with my wife.
My name's Julie Moore Orlowski. I am married to a wonderful guy. I have 3 brilliant children, 3 amazing grandchildren. And I'm been a registered nurse for almost 40 years, thanks to my father. Retired now, thank goodness.
They met at a kind of a poolside cocktail party.
He was at Fort Bragg in North Carolina, and she was a co-ed at the time at University of North Carolina. She was sitting by the pool, and she saw this handsome guy near the pool area.
And Mom thought he was kind of cute.
She says that she goes up to Hal Moore and introduces herself. She says,
"Hi, I'm Julia Compton."
He looked up at her like that and says, "So what?" Just.
That didn't stop her, though.
Says, I chased him until he caught me.
And he realized that she was the one.
This may sound corny, but they are the married relationship that any married couple wants. They define what you hope for in a marital relationship. And they would share that love in small ways, in the way they treated each other, the way they interacted with us.
We always could count on them. We always knew that they were going to be there for us.
Respect and building confidence in one's life infused how our family came together and was raised. My dad and my mom felt that giving their children, and again their troopers, confidence in making decisions on their own was the way they raised us.
You know, they were there. They were mom and dad. They were wonderful people.
One year after they were married, my mother had my first brother. and then a year after that, had the next one. And then 3 months after that, he was in Korea, in the Korean War. And she was left here in Auburn, Alabama with 2 children under 2 years old. She's a wife, a mother of 2 sons, and her husband is off in a war, and she doesn't have the 24-hour access that people have today. And so they wrote a lot. They wrote a lot to each other.
I believe he wrote maybe 117 letters home. He had the discipline, no matter what was going on, to sit down every night and write a letter home.
Dearest Julie, and thus passes another Christmas in the Far East. 4 out of the last 8 for me have been over here, and I hope no more. I sure hope you and your wonderful family had a good Christmas at home along with our precious babies. I opened your Christmas packages on Christmas afternoon, and I can't thank you enough for the wonderful gifts. The stationery set is number 1, and I'm sure I'll enjoy Hemingway's book along with the peanut brittle. Notebook paper really needed too. My Christmas to you was rather skimpy. If mental telepathy could carry the love I have for you, you would never be lonesome. All my love, Hal.
In Korea, he was very explicit about everything that was going on. And to include being dumb enough to say, ooh, I had a close call today. Now in Vietnam, he was explicit about, we're going out on an operation, we're fighting against a PAVN regiment, things like that, but he never talked about what he was doing during Vietnam.
The riflemen of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment were in the thick of battle. The commander of the battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, was the last man to leave the battle.
I have a feeling that if there's one thing that should be taken across to the American people by every news media we have in this country, from the United States, is that we have the best American soldier I think that the world has ever seen.
At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 13th of November, the brigade commander, Colonel Tim Brown, showed up, dropped in a helicopter, and he said, Hal, you're going to go into the Adrain Valley tomorrow morning. You've got 16 helicopters, and your mission is to search for and destroy the enemy.
Dearest Julie, before our first combat mission, one of my cooks of all people kind of shamefully gave me a St. Christopher medal to wear and quietly walked off. It has protected me well so far, and I have faith that I will be okay. However, I would not be truthful to you, to myself, or to my men if I didn't accompany them where the going is the toughest. That is where the commander must always be, to get the proper appreciation of the situation and to take the necessary action for the accomplishment of the mission. All my love, Hal.
When we hit the ground at X-ray, it was all quiet. Then shortly after we had been on the ground for about maybe 45 minutes, one of my companies captured a North Vietnamese prisoner. And he said there are 3 battalions of PAVN troops on the mountain above us. They want very much to kill Americans, but they have not been able to find any. And I knew then that we were in for a hell of a fight.
1,000 U.S. 1st Cavalry troopers have been pinned down and all but encircled by 3 battalions of North Vietnamese regulars, perhaps 2,000 men. Early today, B-52s came to the rescue, dropping more than 350 tons of bombs on the communists. It's estimated at least 350 of the North Vietnamese were killed, but the survivors still held their positions along the mountainside tonight.
The brunt of the enemy's human wave attacks has been taken by General Custer's old unit, the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry.
Hal Moore was the best soldier I've ever met. What he did was immediately realize the survival of this battalion is dependent on our holding this landing zone. He was able to keep things in focus. He immediately changed the plan. We were able to eventually hold out and kill a lot of bad guys. And I was just lucky as hell to be in his unit.
After the battle at LZ X-ray, all the reporters show up on the third day and all did interviews. When you watch what was filmed, and they had Dad on at the end, and he was crying because he lost so many of his troopers.
You must excuse my emotion here, but when I see some of these men go out, where they have, I can't tell you how highly I feel. They're tremendous.
There was no reaction other than stunned silence. That was probably the most horrible experience of the entire war, I know for me.
Dearest Julie, probably by now you know that we took on a North Vietnamese regiment of 4 battalions and cut it to pieces. My men were great. We paid a price which I do not like to think of. I will tell you later who we lost. We all were fighting. Thanks to God, I can write you this note. We were brought into here yesterday afternoon for rest and reorganization. Morale is sky high. These men are great. I love you, and I will write soon with more details. All my love, Hal.
And there's a P.S. in that letter saying, I came through without a scratch. I don't know why. Could you imagine getting that letter? Oh my God. Let me collect myself here a minute.
I'd like to say my mother was strong and knew what an Army wife needed to do right off the bat. But like every other spouse, they didn't raise their right hand to do it. They didn't interview to be an Army spouse. They didn't interview to have their spouse gone and have young kids and be on their own. That happens to you. When the casualties started coming in from the Idrang Valley, she was generally unprepared for that, just like everybody else. They weren't prepared for this to be a real war the way it just became and hit home. You'd like to say that she was a steely, consummate Army wife and did everything right, but that's absolutely not the case. She was scared.
Well, a taxi cruising through the neighborhood would engender terror everywhere. And I think that's probably well known, but I know in the We Were Soldiers movie, there was a scene where a taxi pulls up to our front door, and that actually happened. I was home, I was 13 at the time, and I remember looking out the window, seeing the taxi park, and the taxi driver walking up to the front door. And looking at Mom, she saw the taxi, she turned white, and you could just see her, oh my God. And she went to the door, collected herself, and answered the guy's question. There were a couple of lieutenants in the back of the cab, and they were looking for directions, but that actually happened. I remember it very clearly.
Julie was a really, really fascinating woman, because when the reports that the men were dying came in, they were being delivered by telegram,
right,
by taxi cab. And so it filled the neighborhood in absolute terror. And she saw to it that she went and saw every one of these women just as they were being notified.
We tend to think, oh, she attended every funeral, but it was actually the funeral of Sergeant Gell showing up on the news that night that horrified her, that one of her troopers was going to be interred and had been interred, and no one had notified her. And she just lit up Survivor Assistance Office to ensure that whenever there was a funeral scheduled at Fort Benning, that she would be notified so she could be present. And she was for every subsequent funeral.
She immediately got with sister battalions, the 2nd and the 7th, who was having similar casualties. And she immediately connected with the division commander's wife. And they formed this group that would collectively begin to change the way the Army notified the spouses of these casualties, both from local procedure and policy all the way up to national policy.
I was watching a show with my friend,
And there was a knock on my door, and there were two men standing there, and you know immediately. And they said, "Miss DeCenzo, your husband was killed today in Baghdad." They set me down on the couch, and one of them was holding my hand. I think it was a chaplain was holding my hand. Right.
I went to the door and I said, "Where's John?" I didn't see the chaplains, and he said, "Someone's got to tell you something." And they walked up and told me, and I don't remember much after that.
I was 5 at the time. My memories are a little hazy, but I do remember them getting out and, being, so gentle, sharing the news, and we're doing the best that they could in a tough situation. It has to come from a service member.
We were just overwhelmed, of course, knowing that Hans was gone, and they walked us through every step of what we needed to do. It's been a while, since 2004. I just remember that they were always available, and then would just call and say, "Do you need something? Is there something I can help you with?" And that just meant so much. I cannot imagine getting a phone call or getting a piece of paper to tell you that you've suffered that loss.
They kept asking me, "Do you want me to call somebody?" And they told me the casualty assistance officer was going to come the next day. And so I knew the next step. I knew the plan. I didn't know what was going to happen, but I knew someone was coming to help me the following day. If you're a widow, you've got so much on your plate. And because of the Moores and because of what she did, the system is in place now where I don't have to worry about that. It's not a burden anymore. That's a huge blessing. It's a huge blessing.
Joe and Dad did promise on the I-Drang battlefield, on LZ X-ray, to tell the story. And around 1980, 81, they started saying, it's about time we start to tell the story. They had no idea what it was going to end up looking like, but they spent 10 years writing that book. Dad was able to talk about the actions and his love for his soldiers. Joe was able to build that into a story that communicated to the masses. And between the two was Mom. And much of that book was written here. There's 3 desks in there. He'd have chapter 1 here, chapter 2 here. And then later in life, much to my mother's horror, he started expanding out into the dining room, putting papers on the dining room. And she'd start to get mad. "Hal, get your stuff back in." That's really this was the center of gravity for writing that book.
The thing that Dad did and Joe Galloway, his co-author, did, I think, most remarkably, was spend the time and effort to go to all these veterans, collect all of their stories. What Dad brought all that back, wrote it all up with his own take, and my mom would type this. And all that typescript would then be sent to Joe Galloway. Primary sources organized them in a way that makes the book so compelling and readable because of what the soldiers are saying.
Writing the book, I think, was cathartic for Dad, just being able to reconnect with a lot of the men.
It really became the catalyst for my father and Joe and the I-Drang veterans to come back and deal with their demons and deal with their thoughts that they suppressed for 30 years, 20 years.
You see guys that you ever so close with, and you have a camaraderie that's unbreakable. Yeah, it's one of the highlights on my yearly schedule. It's like seeing your brothers or seeing your family for the first time in a year.
And after that, it's not only writing the book, but there was 20, 30 years of professional development work that he invested back into the Army.
Number one, never quit.
Yeah.
The game of baseball, 3 strikes and you're out. Not so in other endeavors in the game of life.
And that's equally important to his uniformed career. In my deployment to Iraq, and someone found out that my dad was Hal Moore, and the guy came over and goes, "Look what I keep in my backpack." And it was a We Were Soldiers Once book. And it was dog-eared and underlined. It says, "This is my leadership book while I'm here." And that's the impact that he created after he retired.
This past weekend, a movie about the battle called We Were Soldiers opened. When we go into battle, I will be the first to set foot on the field, and I will be the last to step off.
With the making of the movie, they attended certain scenes here and there at Fort Benning. As the movie was getting made, they actually took Mel Gibson and other actors out into the woods with some ranger instructors. They had to train the actors on how to understand what it was like to be an infantryman.
When it came out, I think Mom and Dad were concerned that it would be not authentic, so to speak. I remember Dad telling me that he was on a set and he was trying to tell Randy Wallace what to do, and Randy tapped him and said, "General, this is not a history. This is Hollywood, but we're going to do our best to do it 100%.
And my father took that to heart because he had faith in Randy Wallace. And the only reason the movie was made was because he had that faith in Randy Wallace.
So I said, when this movie is made, I hope you'll be able to say, you have given your last full measure of devotion to your men. And he looked right at me and said, why would I ever want to feel that? Why would I ever want to feel I'd done enough?
Now it's my honor to introduce and welcome the Commanding General of the Maneuver Center of Excellence in Fort Benning, Major General Curtis Buzzer.
Well, good morning, everyone. And it truly is a great Army day, and I'm honored to be here with family of Lieutenant General Hal and Julia Moore. Later this year, we will formalize the name of this installation as Fort Moore in what may be the most culturally significant event of my Army career. My least favorite pictures is this photo of President Obama skying over me playing basketball.
Oh, wow.
It looks like I have no vertical and can't play defense. Yeah, I first learned about General Moore back when I was a lieutenant. His fundamentals of leadership are just enduring, and as I reflect on my own career, and I've gotten an opportunity to serve for some incredible leaders, but I kind of see General Moore as a touchstone of just foundational leadership. Just how much he genuinely cared for his people. What I respect about him so much, and I had an opportunity to meet veterans of 17 Cav who came through for a reunion earlier this year, or late last year, and they just loved him. They would have followed him anywhere.
My father were to know this recommendation and approval was only about him, he would vehemently disagree and oppose it. This renaming now provides the opportunity to honor Julie, to realize that that base renaming opportunity honors her, what she represents, her values, and lifts the Army family in terms of visibility and importance. I believe he would approve of that.
What would your mama say?
Did little old me?
The interesting part to me was learning a little bit about Mrs. Moore. To people that haven't been in the military, it may not resonate, but to people that lived on military bases, that was a significant change. And it was one that was done solely out of compassion and a service to the soldier's family. And for that to carry on, if that is somehow presented to these new soldiers and new trainees, I think it can't help but make them not only better soldiers, but also better people.
Character is highly important. Integrity is highly important. And for the Moores, for what I've seen and what I've learned, as a couple, to be able to do what they did, it shows that they had the consistency, which is every leader should have, to be able to portray those attributes. Because at the end of the day, that's the only thing we really have, is your name, your character, your integrity, and the morals that you have. It is highly important that we stay consistent as leaders, and the Moores brought it home as far as I'm concerned.
What I hope that people take away from the naming of the base and the movie and just the relationship that Mom and Dad had with each other is you can go through a lot of tough things together if you stick together as a unit.
Dad began his career at Fort Benning. My mother connected to Fort Benning through Auburn and through my dad. My dad commanded at Fort Benning, and ultimately my dad's wish was to be buried among his troops at Fort Benning, which came true. So from beginning to end, his life is associated with Fort Benning, and having his life, their partnership associated with the values of Fort Benning, I think is an incredibly strong connection.
The Fort Benning name has taken us since 1918 up until the current day. But what I really think is important and what we want to focus on is that we want to look to the future. We really want to align with the character and commitment of the Moore family moving forward. It's really about new beginnings, and it's really about opening new chapters and trying to inspire 21st century soldiers with the story of the Moore family. And in my opinion, there's not a better one that we can be aligned with.
To know that Mom and Dad's legacy is going to live on forever, to know that they won't ever be forgotten, it's indescribable. It's just indescribable, because it just shows that not only did they mean so much to us, but they did to so many other people. It's just outstanding, as my dad would say, outstanding. Drive on.